So here is question 3, feedback to question 3, which on the whole was done relatively well. However, there are a few misconceptions that we do need to spend some time on. So let's just look at this in a bit more detail then. So the question is asking us, describe the factors you would consider when deciding whether to use massed practice or distributed practice to develop skills. My suggestion, as with the other two questions, would be that whether you're asked specifically or not, you need to give a definition, show your understanding of what mass practice and distributed practice means. And this is where a couple of misconceptions come into play. So mass practice is this idea of practicing a skill for a lengthy period of time without breaks. And that's really important that we understand that. It's working for a long period of time, continuously, without having any breaks. Whereas distributed practice is practicing a skill, usually at high intensity, for a relatively short period of time, with rest periods, usually longer than the work period, in between the work periods. Right? So distributed practice is working and then resting, whereas mass practice is working for a long period of time without resting. The second misconception, which a number of people fell into this trap, was this: mass practice is not necessarily lots of people, a large group of people working at the same time. So please avoid that. Somehow we've got to get rid of that concept, that idea that mass practice equals lots and lots of people. It may do, but it's not necessarily the case. It could be, and I think we discussed this in lessons, that mass practice could be a squash player on his own in the squash court playing forehand drives for half an hour without a break. That is mass practice. All right. So please be aware what we're talking about when we talk about mass practice, and it's not specifically or just necessarily working in a large group. Okay, so once we've identified these two concepts, let's have a look at what we would do in terms of considering when we would use them. So factors concerning performance that affect our decision might be the stage of learning. And again, we've seen this before. We need to make sure we're specific in the terminology we use, and we talk about the stage of learning rather than the age of the performer. And we need to make reference to whether they're experienced, the phase of learning they're in, if it's the autonomous phase or the cognitive phase. And you can see here that mass practice is for experienced performers or learners, and distributed practice is for novice or beginner or cognitive performers. You would get 1 mark for saying mass practice for autonomous. You wouldn't get a second mark necessarily for saying the opposite. But if you just said one of those two, you'd be fine. A lot of people talked about the level of fitness and indicated your understanding that in order to carry out mass practice successfully, you would need to be fit and have a high level of fitness because you are working for a long period of time without having any rests. Similarly, or opposite, in the opposite situation, you would perhaps use distributed practice if you knew your performers were less fit, because it gives them an opportunity for them to rest and recover in their breaks. Likewise, levels of motivation. For massed practice, we would expect or need our performers to be highly motivated because they are working for a long period of time. Whereas for distributed practice, they may be less motivated because they're working for an intense period of time, a short period of time, and then they stop and they recover, they rest, reflect, and then they move on again. So the levels of motivation need to be right for the two different types of practice. Then moving on, what about the task itself? So again, I've talked about ideas of skills, and usually we talk about skill development rather than a task being a game, for example. One of two of you talked about playing a game of rugby or playing a game of basketball. Stick to the idea of developing skills. So for mass practice, we would work on simple skills, i.e. simple skills that don't require much thought, that don't need to be broken down. We can just do them over and over again over a period of time, would be mass practice. Whereas skills which are more complex, which are more difficult to complete, that can be broken down into subroutines or more strenuous, would be best suited to practicing using the distributed method of practice. Alright, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the complexity of the skill. The continuity of the skill talks about whether on our continuity continuum, whether a skill is a discrete skill, which you'll remember is a skill which could be broken down into smaller a discrete skill is a skill which has a clear beginning and a clear end, and that lends itself well to massed practice. So for example, passing a ball in hockey, we just can continue to do that over and over again. Receive the ball, control it, pass it. Receive the ball, control it, pass it. That would be an example of discrete skill. Whereas for more continuous skills, i.e. running, swimming, etc., we need to use distributed practice because of the fact that we're going to be getting tired over time. Also, gross fine type of skill. If we're using fine skills, motor skills which aren't necessarily using many large muscle groups and not going to get us tired, then mass practice may be the most suitable approach. Whereas for gross skills with large muscle movements, distributed practice is probably going to be the best option in this case. A lot of you talked about the time available, and you made the point that if we are limited for time, and perhaps this is where if you've got a larger number in a class, you might use mass practice, but you're making the point that mass practice is because of the time available, not because of the size of the group. We would use mass practice if we are short of time. However, if we've got lots of time, then distributed practice is probably the better option. Speed of action. If the skill that we're looking to develop is rapid, ballistic, we've talked about this before, then we might use mass practice. And if it's longer lasting, as we've said, if it's a continuous type of skill that links into here, then we would use distributed practice. And then the last point is that it's a question of safety, and if there's no danger involved in the practice, then perhaps mass practice might be absolutely fine, whereas if there was potential for danger, then it would be sensible to use distributed practice to ensure that performers are not getting tired, or if there's a particular area which is dangerous, that we focus on that in isolation. So again, even though it's one part of a 12 marker, 6 marks for this, you could make lots of different points and develop those so that you're scoring well in this area. So if you didn't get 6 out of 6 in this one, please make sure you take the time to reflect on that and understand why you didn't, and hopefully the next time you come to look at this one, you'll be able to perform it very well.